Thank you, Anita. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. So before I begin, I just want to thank you for having me here today. I'm really excited to be speaking about very important things to you. I'm going to start with a very brief land acknowledgement. I offer my gratitude to the lands on which the University of Guelph sits. I acknowledge that I work, live, and play in the dish with one spoon territory and the lands of the Attawandaron people and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. I offer my respect to all of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples that reside both here, at home, and across the nation. And there we go. So today I'm going to be talking to you about something that's near and dear to me, and it's about creating spaces for Indigenous voices in brain and mental health research. And I'm going to do this hopefully in a way that everybody can appreciate. And along the way, I'll also be using art to kind of clarify some of my points. So you'll be able to see some of the beautiful Indigenous art that is being generated across Canada. I just want to acknowledge up front the Canadian Brain Research Strategy as well as Neuroethics Canada, who both of which have played a significant role in my work in this area. So I just want to mention them right off the bat. So I am sure that everybody who is watching this seminar has heard about colonization, at least I would hope so. And I suppose most of what people know would come from what they're seeing in mainstream media. So here are some examples of some things that have been in the media quite a bit over the last few years. For example, the atrocities that happened at the residential schools, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, as well as environmental concerns, for example, the dangers of oil pipelines. But there are other more insidious consequences of colonization that generally people do not hear about. So one of them is language. So there are thousands of Indigenous languages across Canada. And at this point, approximately 75% of them are endangered. Another one is the loss of identity. So there are many Indigenous people that have been separated from their culture. It could be 60 scoop children, or even today, there are people that don't feel that they can reconnect with their culture because they feel like they don't fit the stereotype. So they feel fraudulent and they do not believe that they would be welcomed. Even simple things, simple cultural things like what the traditional Indigenous medicines for the smudge are for, or the traditional gifting of tobacco have been lost. Another thing that often the public does not think about is the Western academic suppression of Indigenous communities. So what exactly do I mean by that? So earlier this year, I did a very quick Google search on Indigenous voices in research just to see what came up. And there was many commonalities, but there's a couple I just want to bring to your attention. So the one thing that I saw often on these sites is that research is most impactful when a diverse range of voices is included. So this clearly includes Indigenous people, but in general, it's a very, very important statement. The other one is that Indigenous people's needs cannot be understood and met without Indigenous voices. So hopefully we're going to move in an area out into an era where instead of, we're doing research in Indigenous communities, we'll be doing research with Indigenous communities, and they will be partners. A couple statements or specific quotes that I want to draw to your attention Indigenous communities have long experienced exploitation by researchers, and there is a recognized contradiction between most researchers' perspectives in identifying and addressing community health issues and an Indigenous community's priorities and common goals. So essentially, what Western researchers believe that we need is not necessarily what we need. So I want to explore a little bit about what I mean about exploitation by researchers. What does this look like? So there is a disempowerment and marginalization of communities, and stereotypes are imposed that reinforce internalized racism. And I will speak a little bit more about this. Conducting research that benefit themselves, but bring no tangible benefit to communities. Exploiting these communities by coming in, taking information, and providing nothing in return. Developing projects and performing research without the appropriate consultation and relationship building, using a researcher knows best approach, and disseminating the findings without sharing the data with community members, so there is a loss of data sovereignty. So let's just look at the first one. Stereotypes that reinforce internalized racism. So what exactly do I mean by this? So what I mean is that researchers come in, and what do they see? They see that there are Indigenous problems. And I want to use a couple neuroscience examples for this. So I'm sure, unfortunately, that most people in the audience have heard that we are drinkers, or the slang terminology, drunk as an Indian. These are things that I've often heard, and I'm sure you have as well. But it actually gets worse than this. It has been historically believed that we have an inborn insatiable appetite for alcohol. We are hypersensitive to alcohol, or we cannot hold our liquor. We are inordinately vulnerable to alcohol dependence, and I love this one, inordinately prone to violence when intoxicated. So what this means is that it's not simply a stereotype. It's been believed that we actually have a biological problem with alcohol. So I want to just delve into this a little bit more. This is some data that was provided by Health Canada a few years ago. And I just want to draw your attention to the bars on the right. Let me see if I can get my pointer here. Okay. So here we're looking at various different groups across Canada. We have our non-drinkers, we have our non-Indigenous population here on the right. And then we have various Indigenous populations that do not live on reserves. So we have First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. And then we have here, this bar on the left is the total Indigenous identity population. So the first thing that stands out to me here is that looking at all the bars, more Indigenous individuals actually do not drink at all compared to non-Indigenous individuals. Now, that's not to say that there aren't some concerns, because if we look at the heavy drinking on the left, we can see that non-Indigenous peoples actually do not have heavy drinking compared to Indigenous individuals pretty much across the board. So the problem with this type of research is that nothing is put in context. So, okay, we might have more heavy drinkers in our population and non-drinkers. I want to point out that again. But the question is never asked why, right? So it is just assumed that it is an Indigenous problem without any consideration of what has contributed to these types of behaviors. I want to give you another example. So this is a paper that was done by a wonderful student, Miles Shafrick, who examined papers that had looked at cannabis use among Indigenous peoples. And what he found was that it was the same type of issues. So first of all, there was a lack of transparency about author positionality. There was an underrepresentation of therapeutic, medicinal, and spiritual investigations, as well as a scarcity of studies examining the perceptions of Indigenous people and relevant traditional or cultural connections. And there was an absence of studies that explored the lived experience of Indigenous peoples in cannabis. So there was no context given. Basically, these authors, they write their papers and they're saying, yes, perhaps Indigenous communities can or smoke or imbibe cannabis more often than other communities, but they give no context as to why this may actually be happening, whether there may be medicinal reasons or, reasons based on colonization. So what happens? So they come in and they see that there are Indigenous problems, and then they feel like, hey, they're the perfect people to fix this problem. And generally, what they use is something called deficit-based approaches. So they're framing the community in a narrative of negativity, deficiency, and failure. I really encourage you to read this paper on strength-based approaches. And I will be coming back to this a little later on in the talk, but it really gives a nice framework for describing the difference between these strength-based approaches, which really talk about how to improve these concerns in communities and acknowledging the contributing factors to these concerns, versus just placing the blame solely on us. So when people actually use these deficit-based approaches, it positions whiteness as being the norm, and it also gives privilege to the Western forms of knowledge and ways of living as being superior to our Indigenous ways of knowing and being. And what ends up happening is that it gives Western medicine the power to narrate the truth of Indigenous health. So what is actually happening with respect to brain research? Well, I think my colleague, Dr. Chris Musquash, who is a Canada Research Chair and a professor of psychology at Lakehead University, he stated that Indigenous people are not well represented in brain research. Brain research is not focused on Indigenous peoples or researchers have not yet had the conversations about cultural relevance. If we do not find a way to include Indigenous people, the disparities that exist in these research domains and accessibility to innovations and treatments may only grow. So this quote was actually stated in this paper that was a collaboration with the Canadian Brain Research Strategy, which I am an Indigenous knowledge holder for that group. And we actually brought together various Indigenous researchers, Indigenous community members, people who do Indigenous research that aren't necessarily Indigenous themselves, as well as, again, Indigenous researchers, some of which do Indigenous research, but some which do not do Indigenous research. And we came up with various guidelines, I would say, that as a group, the Canadian Brain Research Strategy needs to focus on moving forward with this type of work. So the first thing is increasing the understanding of heterogeneity of Indigenous communities and nations. So I want to start by saying that this is not just something that the CBRS is doing. This is something that all researchers should be doing 100% of the time. And that goes for all the subsequent points as well. Embracing Indigenous knowledge and the integration of two-eyed seeing. So essentially, you should be going in and having a really good understanding of the culture that you're working with and how to integrate both Western ways of research methodologies with Indigenous ways of doing this research. And I will talk a little bit more about that. Developing new partnerships and networks that embrace strength-based approaches and ethical community engagement, and developing stronger connections between Indigenous researchers, investigators who conduct Indigenous research, as well as Indigenous communities. So let's start with the first one. And I just want to address that the Indigenous peoples of Canada are extremely diverse. Even though we represent only 5% of the population of Canada, there are over 630 distinct First Nations communities representing over 50 nations and comprising about half of the Indigenous population. There are 53 Inuit, which is actually termed the people communities, all of which are in Northern Canada. Over 500,000 self-identifying Métis, most of which are citizens of the various Métis nations across Canada. Now, when we look at where these Indigenous populations are residing, you can see the majority of them are in central Canada, so Quebec, Ontario, Manitoba, although there are definitely Indigenous populations in other regions of Canada as well. So I want to, I think, to really come across or bring across how diverse we actually are, I want to show you various images, which I think really represents this diversity. So the first thing that I want to point out about these images is that they're not restricted to one particular group of Indigenous peoples in Canada. What do I mean by that? So in the center, you'll see there is a medicine wheel right here. So the medicine wheel is used by many, if not most, First Nations and some Métis communities, so it's not restricted to First Nations. So we can see the diversity here. We have some West Coast, which I'm sure all of you in the audience are familiar with. West Coast art, so we're showing a totem pole here. We have some East Coast art, so this is a lovely image by Loretta Gould, as well as a original piece by Jackie Traverse, who is from Manitoba. And we're actually really lucky we commissioned this piece, and it will be going up at the University of Guelph, hopefully very, very shortly. And at the top, I'm sure everybody is familiar with a powwow that I'm showing here. This is traditionally a First Nations event, and this is not something that you would generally see in the other Indigenous groups in Canada. Looking at the Inuit, I'm showing probably one of my favorite pieces of Inuk art. So this is Enchanted Owl by Kinojuak Ashevak. Unfortunately, she had passed on, but this is probably one of the most famous pieces. They're also very famous for their sculptures, and I'm sure that everyone can recognize these images on the right of something that you would traditionally associate with the Inuit communities. And then we have the Métis. So the Métis are a unique group of Indigenous peoples in Canada. They have their own culture. For example, we have various types of dancing, and we have here the fiddle. We're well known for our fiddle playing, and these are Métis sashes. We do a lot of beading, but again, this is by no means restricted to Métis people. Many, many First Nations do beading like this. And in the top right corner, we're seeing some Métis dot art. Again, not only Métis do dot art, but this is, again, a lovely piece that we have commissioned for the University of Guelph. And just to show you the type of work that goes into this, if we zoom in, every single one of these images or flowers that you see are created by a single, actually 3 dots of paint go into every single dot. So it's quite an achievement to be able to do art like this. So I want to move on to embracing Indigenous knowledge. And one thing that is, I would say, fairly common across Indigenous peoples in Canada is that they take a holistic view of health and wellness. But they do practice very diverse spiritual traditions that reflect their own diversity. And this is reflected in a medicine wheel, as shown on the right. Now, notice that I do say a medicine wheel and not the medicine wheel, because what is taught in the medicine wheels would vary across the various communities. But in general, there are 4 aspects to Indigenous peoples or ourselves. So there's the physical, the mental, the emotional, and the spiritual. So you may be asking yourself, okay, so how does this relate to medicine or Western forms of medicine or brain health? So when you're not feeling well, or for any reason, not just mental health, you're going to go to the doctor. And there are so many advantages to doing this. They provide hope, empowerment, medication. But the issue with this type of Western approaches to medicine is that it's void of spirit. And this can be a concern when it comes to Indigenous peoples, because their spirituality, as mentioned on the previous slide, everything is interconnected. So if there is one part that is not well, it is going to influence the other parts. And because the Western-based mental health approaches or therapeutic approaches are void of spirit, that does not provide a full measure of treatment for Indigenous people. So what they would do is they would normally connect their spirituality with the Creator, which encompasses both unity and interconnectedness. And then they feed that spiritual aspect of themselves through various ceremonies. Now, the problem comes when there is a disconnect between spiritual approaches to mental health and Western approaches to mental health. And in fact, many Indigenous peoples experience these barriers in the Western medical world when practicing their spirituality. So this becomes a big concern, because what it leads to is mistrust between the Indigenous patients and the healthcare providers. And so often the patients will not disclose, maybe herbs or whatever is part of their cultural wellness that they use. And this can lead to many, many issues when it comes to the overall treatment of these Indigenous individuals. So I want to move on and talk about two-eyed seeing. And this is where you would start to think about integrating Western ways of knowing and doing things with Indigenous ways of knowing and being. And when you're able to successfully integrate these two things, it is termed two-eyed seeing. So essentially, you're using the strengths of both knowledges for the benefit of everybody. And I want to emphasize here that it is a weaving of perspectives. So both have equal importance. However, there is also an acknowledgement that sometimes one eye has to take precedence over the other, depending on the specific scenario. So I'm hoping that everyone in the audience can kind of see how integrating both Western and Indigenous knowledge would be not only beneficial to the Indigenous patient when we're talking about medicine, for example, but how it would also be beneficial and eye-opening for the research practitioners, giving them a more empathetic and culturally open view of medicine. And this would translate not only to Indigenous peoples, but other groups as well. So how do we actually incorporate two-eyed seeing when we're doing research? So this is a really great paper that actually describes how to do it in a research setting. So the first thing is defining the characteristics of two-eyed seeing. So examples of this would be decolonization. Again, we're seeing these strength-based approaches again. Learning together and reflection is also really important when doing research with Indigenous communities. When you're the person who is actually engaging with two-eyed seeing, you have to come at it from a certain perspective. So you have to have an appreciation and be open to spiritual wellness. There needs to be communication, trust building, and honesty. Patience is really, really important. This takes a long time, and you have to be open to valuing different perspectives. When it comes to applying two-eyed seeing in research, the relationships absolutely have to be authentic and reciprocal. There has to be Indigenous involvement, so partnerships and Indigenous ways of knowing must form the basis for the research design. So you go in and it's not about what you think they need, it's about what they actually need. And you find this out through conversations and relationship building. Importantly, the Western researchers must be willing to take a back seat. So it's really easy for me to sit up here and tell you, well, this is what you should do. But it's not that easy. And I want to use this paper as an example because I think it really gives a great example of how things can go wrong. So this paper is about, it gives a case or a case study essentially of a group of researchers that had developed a long-standing relationship with an Indigenous community. And they were researching essentially relationships between healthcare providers and Indigenous patients. And what they would do, so it was a true partnership, right? So the Indigenous community members were actually part of everything from the research design. And what happened was they were doing interviews. So they had workshops with Indigenous people, and they did interviews where people would kind of disclose their personal experiences that they had with these healthcare providers. So the group of researchers gets together with the community members, and in the past, they've always been very interactive. And they have all this data, and the Western researchers say, okay, so we're going to separate these transcripts into themes. So commonalities that people said, we're going to separate all those into themes. And then we will come back and we'll discuss it. So during this whole conversation, the Indigenous community members were pretty quiet, which really were not like them at all. But suffice it to say, they go off, the researchers go off, and they separate these transcripts into these various themes. So a while later, they come back and they're talking about the various themes. And as well, I want to point out here that, as is normally seen in when doing this type of research, it is completely private. So we don't know who said what. It's completely anonymous. So they're all having this conversation. I don't want to say all, because again, the Indigenous community members are being really quiet. And at this point, the researchers are quite perplexed as to what's going on. And then through a little bit of probing, one of the Indigenous community members says, I don't really understand what you mean by this concept of themes, because what you're doing is you're pulling apart people's stories. That is taken away from their experiences. And we are not the type of people who pulls things apart, but rather we bring them together. And as well, you have removed the names of the people who had these experiences. So in effect, you're actually taking away from their experience. And if one of these are an elder, that is important to us, because that brings us closer to our elder, and you're actually taking this away from us. So even through years of relationships, there is still ways in which things can go wrong. And I guess the point of the story is, well, two things. So first of all, mistakes happen. So as long as you're willing to learn and communicate, then that's okay. Like, it's okay that mistakes happen. The second thing is, it can take a long time, and it's never going to be perfect. And it's just, again, it comes really down to communication and listening and embracing other ways of knowing when you find that there is a conflict or it does not seem to connect. And in this way, you can bring two different viewpoints and approaches together in a successful way. So I really like this pictograph, because I think it really takes into consideration how to use strength-based approaches in Indigenous research. So here you can see we have two big things highlighted: colonization and historic trauma. But then below, we have all the different things that are impacted by not only colonization and trauma, but everything along the outer circle. And then other things such as climate change and environment, that all come together to impact on these three things. So physical and mental health, cultural identity, and resilience. So on the right here, in line with that, we start pulling apart these various things that are contributing to what we're seeing in these communities. And it's an acknowledgement of Western influences on these Indigenous communities and the impacts of colonization. So for example, aside from racism, discrimination, the Indian Act, and residential schools, which are huge and what people tend to focus most on, there are also things like, is there cultural supports available in the community? Is there healthcare access available in the community? Are there social networks and various other kinds of supports in the community? What about other things? What's the housing like? What's the education? And what are these contributing factors? So it's not going in to these communities and saying, you have an Indigenous problem and we need to fix your Indigenous problem. It's acknowledging the underlying basis for these things that are happening in this community. And instead of pointing the finger at people, it's about understanding and how to improve the supports that are available. So there are various different types of strength-based approaches, and I'm just listing a few here. But the point is, they support and they reinforce positive change instead of being negative all the time. So an example is resilience approaches. So this is concerned around the personal skills of the individual. There are socio-ecological approaches, which focus on individual, community, and structural aspects of a person's environment. And of course, there's socio-cultural approaches, which examines more social relations and collective identities and practices. So there is a big, big difference between these positive strength-based approaches and these highly negative deficit-based approaches, which have historically been the way that Western researchers have approached research with, or at the time in Indigenous communities instead of with us. In the end, one of the big things that I want to highlight is that for Indigenous people, culture is healing. So there really needs to be an understanding and appreciation of the value of culture for Indigenous communities. So when we talk about brain research, one thing that comes up a lot is the idea of connectivity, especially when we're thinking about how brain regions are communicating with each other. But connectivity actually builds upon Indigenous knowledge that everything in the universe is connected. And these, I'm using art to actually show some of what I mean by this. So on the left, we're seeing the environment. So how we're connected to the environment. In the middle, we're showing how we're connected to our ancestors and our spirituality. And on the right, it's connection with the animals. So it's not a hierarchical thing, which is how Western civilizations generally look at it. We're not above the animal. We're not above the environment. We are at the same level. It truly is interconnectivity and partnership with these various types of things. So it is important to build individual and community relationships. This, again, it's not always an easy thing because it always takes time. So that has to be acknowledged. There always has to be trust and transparency and patience. You have to be invested in making this work, and you need to be involved. Importantly, you have to reciprocate, and you have to choose your teams wisely. So you have to have people that are of this like mind. And of course, you should have Indigenous contributions at every single stage of your research. Cultural competence training may be required for many people involved in the research. And this is just a general slide that I took from the US Department of Health Cultural Training. And I think it really makes you think about all the different things that you need to consider when doing research, not only in Indigenous communities, but in all communities, especially from underrepresented groups. So you can see here, there's some really, really important things that you need to consider that help you frame a positive approach to these research, the research approaches that you're going to use. Building networks. So we don't live in a bubble, right? So it's important to acknowledge that if you're doing research in Indigenous community, you need to not think of that community, like lump that community in with every other community, because the community in the next province or in the next area or down south, their culture is different. Sure, there may be some similarities, but it's also different. So it is important that you develop a network, right? And try and have an understanding of what this diversity is and develop relationships. And not only with communities, but with Indigenous researchers that do Indigenous research, and non-Indigenous researchers that do Indigenous research. And also recognize at the same time that there's many of us, such as myself, that do not do Indigenous research, and we've chosen a different path, and that is 100% okay. Turtle Island has no borders, so don't restrict yourself to Canada. There are many, many Indigenous researchers and Indigenous communities that you could get to know and network with south of the border. So as I approach closer to the end of the talk, I just want to talk for a moment about Indigenous data sovereignty and dissemination. So for those that don't know what this means, it is the right of Indigenous peoples to control the data that is created with or about themselves. Nothing about us without us. And it gives us the authority in our data and knowledges and aims to redefine people's relationship, Indigenous people's relationships to research, from being participants, as I mentioned earlier, to actually being meaningful partners and co-researchers. And I do want to add here that this should be with every single marginalized group that you work with. So it's not just Indigenous communities. If you're working with transgender communities, you work with transgender communities. There should be transgender researchers on your research team, or community members on your research team. So it also reflects decolonization of the data. So this is how the data is controlled. And it also gives the power to communities to decide how and when this data is gathered, analyzed, accessed, as well as used. I also want to, again, emphasize this point that there needs to be an understanding and appreciation of diversity in Indigenous researchers. And I gave a talk actually in BC to high school students, not Indigenous high school students, not long ago. And one of the things that I said is that it is okay to follow your own path. There is one thing that I can say that I have experienced, and I continuously still experience. It is the pushing of Indigenous researchers, in that if you're Indigenous, you have to do Indigenous research. That is where you belong. And it's so frustrating because I see these amazing, students coming up through university, and they are in chemistry, or they want to be engineers, and in discussion with these students, and even the high school students, I had most wonderful emails from them. They feel such pressure to have to be a certain thing. And if that is not what their passion is, they're lesser than. One of the students actually said she thought there was something wrong with her because she wanted to be, I believe it was a chemist, and that didn't fit with the narrative that's placed around Indigenous people when it comes to what they want to do with their lives. And I want to emphasize here that it's important to have diverse voices in all disciplines. Even though our focus might not be Indigenous based, it's who we are. So we bring that with us into whatever discipline that we're going into. So to finish off, I just want to show again this pictograph, which I thought was really great, which talks about some of the things that are needed to do research with Indigenous communities. And again, I do again want to emphasize not just Indigenous communities, but cultural competency, transparency, capacity building, dissemination are so important. And I do think there are some things missing on this pictograph, and I did add it at the right. Some of the things, again, I talked about today: diversity, strength-based approaches, two-eyed seeing, and network building. So I thought it prudent to finish off with the third commission that we have that will be going up at the University of Guelph. And I wanted to show it last because I think the title is really reflects where I hope that the future of research are going to go, and that we're going to shift the narrative from doing research in Indigenous communities to making them partners in everything that we do in this area, and give some consideration to strength-based approaches, and think about how can we make this better than it's historically been. So with that, I just want to again acknowledge Neuroethics Canada and the Canadian Brain Research Strategy. Acknowledgements to Elder Dr. Malcolm King, Dr. Chelsea Gable, and Dr. Chris Mushquash that were on the paper that I talked about in the work with the CBRS. Dr. Judy Illes, I could not have done half of what I do without that woman. She is truly a powerhouse Dr. Ryan Gregory, who is one of my biggest allies. I'm a firm believer of getting powerful white allies on board. And I have a lot of Indigenous initiatives going on at the University of Guelph that I could not have accomplished without using his power. And of course, some of the artists that I spoke about today, I just want to give their contact information in case anyone is ever interested in commissioning them for some art. They're amazing people. And with that, that is it. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Perreault. I'm pretty sure it was a lot of information, and a lot of us are still taking in that information slowly. We do have a few questions and comments in the chat. Maybe I'll address the one about OCAP first. There was a request if you could speak about OCAP and then a follow-up comment and about the need to approach OCAP with a nation-specific lens.
Okay, so first, I'm going through some of the comments. And yes, so I can provide the references that everyone needs. I also want to mention that some of the data is old, so forgive me for that. So, right, like the 0% Indigenous people in the Yukon, my student, my actual graduate student is Métis from the Yukon. So that is erroneous. These are like I said, old tables. So if you find errors in them, I apologize. Yes, I will provide the slides. I have no problem doing that. And okay, so everything that we do needs to be done with a nation-specific lens. Métis, First Nations, Inuit, but it's more than that. It needs to be a lens on the community itself that you're working with, if that makes sense. So as I said, First Nations, I'm going to use them as an example. To assume that working with a First Nations community on the West Coast would be the same as working with a First Nations community on the East Coast would be completely erroneous. So when you're preparing research documents or disseminating data, or even the perceptions that you have going in, this is why relationship building is so important, because you're having a relationship with a specific community, right? That's where you're doing your research in it, because it's impossible to do research on Indigenous peoples of Canada, because that would just be foolhardy. So you have to think beyond the three major groups and think more of honing in on the particular community that you're working with and developing those relationships. And as you develop those relationships, you're going to learn about what makes them unique as an Indigenous community. And again, while there may be some similarities, you're probably going to find that there's more differences between these communities than similarities. So I would be more specific than just saying the three: First Nations, Inuit, or Métis. Scott?
Hi, Dr. Perreault. I just want to thank you for your talk today. You made a really important comment, I think, and it's something that's come up in the last week. For myself, I'm BC Métis, and one of the things that I often rub up against talking to other Indigenous scholars is that there's an expectation, because I'm Indigenous, that I do Indigenous health research. And I just want to acknowledge that comment, and please keep telling other Indigenous youth and scholars as they're coming up that is not their sole responsibility, that they do not need to take on that burden, because sometimes it can be really heavy stuff, and if it's not what you're passionate about, it can just burn you out so quickly. So please keep spreading that message, is one I wholeheartedly believe in as well. I just want to thank you for saying that out loud for everyone to hear today.
I really appreciate that. I think it's one of the, you know, going through my education and my training and constantly running into like banging my head against the wall over and over. Even now, they had NSERC, one of the big heads of NSERC came and they wanted to talk to Indigenous, it was for Indigenous or non-Indigenous people that do Indigenous research. And I reached out because I thought, oh, wow, I get to meet this person. This would be great. And I was excluded because I didn't fit the narrative of what is considered important for an Indigenous researcher. So that has, it's ongoing. It's an ongoing battle. It certainly hasn't stopped for me, but I think it is the main driving force for me in trying to get these students, high school students, university students, to know that it's okay, that they can do whatever they want. And most of the supports that I've developed are in STEM programs where representation is particularly low. And I feel like that's where we need most of our efforts put forth, is to get these students to not only attract them to these fields, but to retain them. Right. And so that is a battle I will never stop. Thank you for supporting me. Your comments, they always mean a lot, knowing that I'm on the right path. And it's not easy. The Métis Nation of Ontario is getting a lot of slack right now. And sometimes it wears me down so much. And it's like, can I keep doing it? Can I keep doing it? And it's comments like that, Scott, that keep me doing it. So thank you.
I just wanted to say thank you, Dr. Perreault. I know that our audience, majority of us are from the BC Children's Hospital Research Institute. So we do a lot of research, but there are physicians, there are a lot of folks who work as well on the front end of health services. So this has been very eye-opening, and I'm sure a lot of us are slowly, like I said before, just absorbing all of this information. If it is helpful to all of you, I will be sharing the slide deck, and the recording will be made available for any of you who'd like to rewatch certain parts of the webinar or review. So I just want to say thank you, and I'm sure our paths will cross.
Great. Thank you very much for having me. And did I send you the slides, Anita?
Not yet.
Okay, I will absolutely send you those slides and you can
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.